Now, what we're going to do here is I'm going to give you 6 lines of evidence that the New Testament documents are telling the truth. They all begin with the letter E to help you remember them. Early testimony. We have early testimony. We also have eyewitness testimony. I'm just going to list them right now. We're going to drill down on a couple of these. We don't have time to do all of them. There's also embarrassing testimony. I'll explain what that is in a minute. We have excruciating testimony. I'll explain that one as well. We have expected testimony, and we also have extra-biblical testimony. And in the book, chapter 11 of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, there's a chapter called The Top 10 Reasons We Know the New Testament Writers Told the Truth. These are just 6 of them. There's 4 more in the book. We only have time to drill down on a couple, so I'm going to drill down on embarrassing and excruciating. But let me just say just a couple of quick words about these other ones. Early testimony. Most, if not all, the New Testament documents are written prior to 70 A.D. And much of the testimony obviously comes much earlier than that. In fact, the earliest testimony of the resurrection is actually in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 to 8. It's an ancient creed that was passed on orally that even atheists agree is pre-40 A.D. In other words, it goes back to the resurrection event itself. There's eyewitness testimony. Just between the Gospel of John and the book of Acts, there's over 140 details that have been verified to be details that only an eyewitness would know. All these details, by the way, are listed in chapter 10 of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. I'll get to embarrassing and excruciating in a minute. Expected testimony. That deals with Old Testament prophecy. As you know, there's many Old Testament prophecies predicting a Messiah. If I only had one to make my case on, it would be Isaiah chapter 53. And if you've never read Isaiah chapter 53, go home and read it and ask yourself, who is this about? When you read it, you'll go, hey, this is about Jesus. The problem is it's written 700 years before Jesus. And we know it was written prior to Jesus because the greatest of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Isaiah scroll, which I just saw last month in Jerusalem, the replica of it in the Shrine of the Book Museum, was 24 feet long. The entire book of Isaiah, and included in it was Isaiah 53, and that scroll dates from at least 150 BC. So we know this is prior to Christ. And then there's extra-biblical testimony. There's 10 ancient non-Christian sources within 150 years of Jesus' life that these non-Christian sources mention briefly Jesus and the apostles and the events of the New Testament. Just very briefly, people like Josephus, Suetonius, Thallus, Phlegon, I'm sure you've read them on your devotionals at times. These kinds of people, you add up all of these brief references to Jesus and the apostles, and you get a story that's very similar to the New Testament. But let's drill down on embarrassing testimony. Now, what is embarrassing testimony? Embarrassing testimony is testimony that most scholars will say must be true. And the reason for this is, if you find something embarrassing to the author or authors in the text, chances are that's not going to be invented. Right? You're not going to make up details that make yourself or your hero look bad, right? In fact, let me ask you guys the question this way. How many people in here have ever lied to make yourself look good? If you don't have your hand up right now, you're lying to make yourself look good, and we know you're lying. It's not working. How many people in here have ever lied to make yourself look bad? You don't lie to make yourself look bad. You might lie to make yourself look good, but you don't lie to make yourself look bad. Well, the New Testament documents, and this is true of the Old Testament documents, by the way, are filled with embarrassing details about the authors and even potentially about Jesus, we'll see. And that's why we call this, by the way, the duh factor. They wouldn't have made this up. Notice, they depict themselves as dim-witted. They fail to understand what Jesus is saying several times. They don't even know what his mission is until he's already ascended to heaven. Then they finally get it. But they depict themselves as dimwits. They are uncaring. They fall asleep on Jesus not once but twice. Stay up with me and pray. This is my greatest hour of need. He's in the Garden of Gethsemane. He's about to be executed. We'll do it, Lord. Don't worry. What do they wind up doing? Not once but twice. And then they make no effort to give Jesus a proper burial. Who buries Jesus? Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. Joseph of Arimathea is a member of the Sanhedrin. Why would they make him, who sentenced Jesus to die, his counsel? Why would they make him look like a good guy while they ran away and hid for fear of the Jews? And why would they put Jesus in a Jewish tomb? What could the Jews have done if the Christians began claiming Jesus had risen from the dead, yet Jesus' own dead body is in the Jews' own tomb? What could the Jews have done? They could have gone to their own tomb, taken out his dead body, and say, stop all this nonsense talk about the resurrection. He's dead. Here's his body right here. They didn't do that at all. What did they do? They said the disciples came and stole the body while the guards were asleep. Now, that's a bad explanation for at least two reasons. Reason number one, if you're a Roman guard on duty and you fall asleep on watch, what happens to you? You're toast. Reason number two, if you're a Roman guard on duty and you fall asleep on watch, how do you know what happened? What happened? Well, you see, we were asleep. And while we were sleeping, and remained sleeping, the disciples came and stole the body. Well, how would you know? Stop asking us questions and just give us the bribe. There's also a third reason why this makes no sense. What motive would the disciples have to steal the body and then say Jesus had risen from the dead? To get them excommunicated from the synagogue and then beaten, tortured, and killed? Why would they do that? That doesn't make any sense. You say, Frank, well, how do you even know this story is true? This alleged story, because it's in the Gospel of Matthew. Well, how do you know the Gospel of Matthew is telling us the truth? Because it's not just the Gospel of Matthew who tells us this. There's an ongoing debate in early Christianity, the early history of Christianity. Christians kept saying Jesus has risen from the dead. The Jews kept saying the disciples came and stole the body while the guards were asleep. Now, what does that explanation admit? That the body wasn't there, that the tomb was empty. You see, you don't have to come up with an empty tomb story if he's still in there, right? You would just take the body out and say, no, he's dead. The Jews admitted the tomb was empty by coming up with this alibi. So if you wanted to, by the way, you can add a seventh E. What would be the seventh E? Enemy testimony. Enemy testimony is very powerful. Why? Because if your enemy says something that helps your case, it's probably true, right? Like, for example, if your mom says you're brave, we go, okay, whoop-de-doo, it's mom. But if your arch enemy says you're brave, you're probably brave, right? Why would your enemy say that? Also, notice they are rebuked. Peter, their leader, is called Satan by Jesus. You think they made this up? You think Peter, or Mark, who recorded this, said to Peter, hey, Pete, I'm going to make this a real interesting story. I'm going to have the Lord call you Satan. What do you think Peter would have said? Have him call you Satan. Why is he calling me Satan? I'm the leader here. And then Paul rebukes Peter for being wrong about a theological issue. He says, look, I told Peter to his face that he was wrong for trying to get these New Testament believers to obey the Old Testament law. Now, why would they say that if they're making all this up? Why would they have one apostle rebuking another apostle, who later on the church says is the first pope? Why would they have them rebuking, or Paul rebuking Peter, if they're making all this up? They wouldn't have this embarrassing kind of exchange going on. The reason it's in here is because it's true. By the way, I don't know, how many people in here have ever saw, this was back in February, there was a debate, there was a very popular debate between Ken Ham and Bill Nye. How many saw that debate? How many thought that was a good debate? Yeah, very few of us, me included. Well, on February 8th, I did a radio show on this, and it's on our app. If you get our free app, you can listen to the show. And I said, here's some great things Ken Ham did, and here's some things I wish he had done differently. And, of course, it's easy being a Monday morning quarterback. I know debates are hard, and he did some very good things. But it wasn't just what he said. It was what he didn't say that was the problem. And so I was being, I thought, very gracious. But I get an email from a listener who says, you ought not be criticizing other Christians. What was she doing to me? She's criticizing me, right? Should we not criticize other Christians? Paul criticizes Peter in the Bible. In fact, Paul points out a lot of people who aren't doing things properly. Jesus does too. Don't buy into this nonsense, we can't criticize other Christians. No, you don't have to be unkind doing it. In fact, one of the main reasons we have this scripture is to correct one another. 2 Timothy 3 gives us the reason we have the scriptures. It's to make you wise unto salvation and is useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and helping everybody do good works. So we have to correct one another. In fact, the word disciple comes from discipline. In order to become more like Christ, we have to correct one another. And one thing about that debate, I want to ask you guys this question. And this is the question I asked the radio audience. As you know, the Ken Ham, Bill Nye debate really centered around the age of the earth. That was the whole thing, which I think was silly. Here's why. Question. Is it possible that Christianity is true and the universe is 13.8 billion years old? Yes. Question 2. Is it possible that Christianity is true but God does not exist? No. So why are you spending all your time debating how old the universe is when you can spend time giving evidence that God exists? You see my point? Spend time on the major issues. Don't minor in issues that are not major issues, particularly when you have an opportunity before a national audience to debate somebody and give them the best shot that we have. Outside of that, I don't feel strongly on it. Okay. They are also cowards. Peter denies Christ 3 times after saying, Lord, I'll never deny you. And then the disciples run away. This is like a Monty Python movie. Run away. Oh, they all run away. And who are the brave ones? The women. The women are the brave ones. Now, who wrote this down? Men. Now, what man is going to say that he was hiding for fear of the Jews while the women went down and discovered the empty tomb? Would any man in here say that? No way. I mean, if I was making this up, I'd write something down like, let's see, we marched right down there and overpowered that elite Roman guard. Yeah, that sounds good. And then we saw Jesus, who congratulated us on our great faith. And then we went and comforted the trembling women. I would never say I was Mr. Sissy Pants while the women went down and discovered the empty tomb. And oh, by the way, why would you never say in that culture that the women were the first witnesses? Yeah, because in that culture, a woman's testimony was not considered on par with that of a man. So if you're making up the New Testament story, you'd only have the men be the first witnesses. But all 4 Gospels say the women were the first witnesses, which is telling us what? They really were. They wouldn't have said it that way. Actually, a lady came up to me once after I was doing a seminar like this, and she said, I know why Jesus appeared to the women first. I said, why? And she said, because he wanted to get the story out. I said, that is an excellent point. I had not thought of that before. I mean, ladies, when your man comes home from work, does he say much? There could have been a nuclear explosion down at the plant. He's not going to tell you, right? You imagine Peter coming home that first Resurrection Sunday, his wife sees him and says, hey, honey, anything happening at work today? Nah. Same old, same old. Wait, I heard Jesus had risen from the dead just like he had predicted. Is it true? Oh, yeah, it is. What do you got to eat around here? You see, men don't say much. Also, notice they are doubters. Despite being taught several times that Jesus would rise from the dead, the disciples are doubtful when they hear of his resurrection. Not only are they doubtful when they hear of his resurrection, check this out. Some are even doubtful after they see him risen. After they see him risen. This is Matthew 28:17. What happens in Matthew 28:19? Anyone? The Great Commission. The Great Commission. This is a climactic point in the gospel. This is the end of Matthew. Jesus is there with his disciples. And he says, go, therefore, make disciples of all nations. Notice he doesn't say make believers. Make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. And lo, I'm with you always, even to the end of the age. And as he's giving that climactic Great Commission, some are standing there going, you see that guy over there? Yeah. That guy over there is Jesus. Oh, no, it can't be Jesus. He was just killed not long ago. I saw it. No, it's Jesus. It can't be Jesus. He was killed. He was crucified. The spear went in his side. Blood and water came out. He was dead. I'm telling you, the Romans killed him. No, it's Jesus. It can't be Jesus. It is. How do you know it's Jesus? The women told me. See, they're not making this up. There's even potentially embarrassing testimony in here about Jesus himself. Notice in John chapter 3, he's considered out of his mind by his own family who come to seize him and take him home. His own family thinks he's nuts. Now you've heard people say, well, you know, the New Testament writers embellish Jesus to be God. Oh, really? Then why are they putting this kind of thing in there? Also, he's deserted by many of his followers. In John chapter 6, he says, look, if you want to follow me, you must eat my flesh and drink my blood. And many of the disciples said, this is a hard teaching. We can't follow this guy anymore. Hey, if I was there, I'd say the same thing. Eat flesh, drink blood. What are you, a cannibal? I'm not following you either. And who would have made up eat flesh, drink blood? That's not a made-up doctrine. Maybe embarrassing in that context, but it's certainly not made up. He's not believed in by his own brothers. In John chapter 7, his own brothers don't believe in him. Now, that's very embarrassing to have your own family, your own brothers not believe in you. We learn later, however, that James, the half-brother of Jesus, dies as a martyr in 62 A.D. He's the pastor of the church in Jerusalem. The Sanhedrin throw him off the Temple Mount, and when he hits the ground, they bludgeon him to death. They stone him. Why is he dying as a martyr for his brother when Jesus was on the earth before the resurrection, he did not think his own brother was God? You know who tells us what actually happened? Actually, that martyrdom isn't recorded in the New Testament documents. Two historians tell us this. Josephus, who was in Jerusalem at the time, the Jewish historian who lived from 37 A.D. to 100 A.D., and Hegesippus, who lived later, he's another historian, he tells us a similar account. Yet we know that it seems James became a believer because Jesus appeared to him. In the Creed, 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 to 8, it says Jesus appeared to James. And that convinced him that his own brother was God. But when Jesus was on the earth prior to the resurrection, James didn't think his own brother was God. Now, how many people in here have a brother? All right, how many people in here have a brother who thinks he's God? Yeah, you don't believe in him either, do you? Of course not. James didn't either. He's thought to be a deceiver. He turns off Jewish believers to the point that they want to stone him. In John chapter 8, he's talking to Jews who believed in him. And he gets in the conversation to the point where he says, look, if you believe in Abraham, you ought to believe in me. And they said, we're not believing you, not believing in you. And he said, look, I knew Abraham. So if you're following Abraham, you ought to believe in me. And they said, you're not even 50 years old. How could you know Abraham? And he said, before Abraham was born, I am. And they immediately picked up stones to stone him. Why? They knew what he was claiming to be. What was he claiming to be? He's claiming to be Yahweh from the Old Testament. What's the I am quotation from? Yeah, Exodus 3:16, or Exodus 3:14, the burning bush. Do you remember when God appeared to Charlton Heston? Moses says to God, who should I tell the Israelites you are? And God says, tell them I am sends you. What does I am mean? I am means the self-existent eternal one. The being that had no beginning will have no end. The being that created and sustains all of creation. The being whose essence is his existence. The being who is being. Everybody else has being, he is being. That's who Jesus claimed to be. He claimed to be Yahweh. That's why the Jews picked up stones to stone him. They knew exactly what he was saying. Now, it amazes me today there are people out there who say Jesus never claimed to be God. Like Jehovah's Witnesses. When they come to my door, I go, come on in. Have a seat. Want something to drink? They get the Watchtower material out. I go, whoa, before we get to the Watchtower, can I just ask you a couple of questions? Yeah, sure. First question I ask all unbelievers. If Christianity were true, would you become a Christian? Difficult for Jehovah's Witnesses because they'll get disfellowshipped. Just like Muslims who may be killed, Mormons may get disfellowshipped. So there's a lot riding on them personally to give up their current beliefs. But second question is just for Jehovah's Witnesses, and it's this. If Jesus never claimed to be God, then why did they kill him? For saying love your neighbor? Does that get you killed? Imagine Jesus is out giving a sermon, so he says, so love your neighbor. And there's people in the audience going, what did you say? Did he say love you? We can't tolerate that. You must die. No, you don't get killed for saying love your neighbor, but you get killed for claiming to be God. Why? Because in that context, the Jewish context, that's blasphemy. And in the Roman world, that's sedition. Early on in Christianity, the Romans knew the Jews, or the Christians were not Jews, so they called them atheists. Why did they call them atheists? Because they wouldn't worship the Roman Godhead or give any sort of honor to Caesar. So they figured these people must be atheists. That's the reason Jesus was killed. He was killed because he claimed to be God. He wasn't killed for skipping around saying, love your neighbor and bless those who persecute you. He was killed precisely because he claimed to be God. Also, Jesus is called a madman. He's called a drunkard. He's called demon-possessed. Hey, that's real flattering. Think they just put that in there for laughs? Also, he has his feet wiped with the hair of a prostitute, which easily could have been seen as a sexual advance. You notice, by the way, there are 2 prostitutes in Jesus' bloodline, the Messiah's bloodline. Do you think Matthew and Luke got together and said, you know what? We need to spice up the Messiah's bloodline a little bit. Let's put a couple of prostitutes in there. Let's see, Rahab, Tamar. Why don't we also put in there like a David? He's an adulterer and a murderer. And let's put Bathsheba in there. She's an adult. In fact, one of the writers won't even mention Bathsheba's name. What does he say? Uriah's wife. Now you get all these embarrassing details in the Messiah. The Messiah's bloodline. You don't find anything similar to this in other ancient histories, like, for example, in Egypt. You don't find any embarrassing details about the pharaohs. Why? Because the pharaoh would chop the heads off of his historians if they started saying embarrassing details about him. But the New Testament and the Old Testament is filled with embarrassing details about the supposed heroes of the faith. Why? Because they're just telling the truth. The only one that isn't stained by sin is Jesus, yet all these embarrassing things, or potentially embarrassing things, are related to Jesus. Why? Because they're telling the truth. They're not making this up. Also, he's crucified despite the fact that anyone who's hung on a tree is under God's curse. If you're making up a Messiah to the Jews, you don't hang him on a tree. You may have him come in on a white horse, you may have him come in and slay the Romans, but you don't hang him on a tree. Because according to Deuteronomy 21:23, that man is under God's curse. Well, he was under God's curse. What curse? The curse of sin that we put him under.